Ooh, I am sweating, and it's not just because I'm going to talk about the Google Manifesto, it's also because it's kind of warm in here. So, what was the Google Manifesto? The Google Manifesto was an internal memo that was circulated at Google by a guy called James Damore, in which he describes Google's ideological echo chamber, as he called it, suggesting that there is a lot of work done to eliminate unconscious biases in the workplace, but what they never talk about is any ideological biases or moral biases, as he calls them. In the document, James Damore lays out a case for why women are less represented in tech, and he puts this down to biological drivers. He says that these are across all cultures, that even boys that are castrated at birth and raised as girls still tend to show these preferences. Also, another bit of research that I hadn't read about before, which was very interesting, which seems to suggest that as nations become more prosperous, if the differences between men and women were just cultural, you'd expect our interests to converge, that people would go into the same jobs just because they're able to and they're not held down by the patriarchy anymore. But what you actually see in the more developed nations with greater equality and freedom, such as Scandinavian nations, you actually see a divergence where you get more women in nursing, more men in construction. This was picked up by the media and everybody seemed to get really interested in it. Many people mischaracterize the majority of his memo as suggesting that he was talking about ability, whether women are able to code as well. And I think, well, some of it he was a little bit awkward and wasn't making it clear whether he was talking about ability, but most of what he's actually describing is interest, and I think that's quite interesting. What were these differences he was describing? So one of the things he was describing was how women are more agreeable than men, how they have greater openness directed towards aesthetic and emotion. He also said that women are less status-driven, that men will work harder for longer hours, stay behind, and deal with the stress, which is another thing he talks about women not being able to handle, of leadership positions. He also says that, and this was based on some research by Simon Baron-Cohen, who is Sacha Baron Cohen's brother, suggesting that men are more interested in systemizing and that women are more interested in empathizing. He says for these reasons, women are less suited to leadership roles, and measures to increase diversity in that area are doomed to fail and bad for business. Now, this is really interesting, but it's naturally an awkward topic, and I think what's fascinating here is that he's talking about moral biases. He's exposing our own moral biases and his moral biases while he's doing so. And what's happened is now there is a pushing apart, and there's now people on either side, on James Damore's side, saying, you're right, there are fundamental differences between men and women, and that's why we don't need more diversity. And then there's people on the other side saying there are no differences between men and women, it's all cultural, it's all just due to the fact that men at tech companies are unpleasant to women and it's an unwelcoming environment, and once you get rid of that, you'll see a 50-50 representation in tech. Both of them are idiots. First, we need to ask that awkward question. Are men and women different? Obviously they're different. Come on, please. 90% of the planet is very clear that there are differences between men and women. Of course, because these track across cultures. It's also linked to prenatal testosterone, which is something I've discussed before. A quick and dirty measure of this is to look at the difference in height between your ring finger and your index finger. A longer ring finger suggests higher levels of prenatal testosterone, which means that you're exposed to more testosterone in the womb, and that will exhibit certain traits that you could broadly call masculine, which is higher appetite for risk, for example. This is one of the reasons it will drive people, men particularly more than women, to ask for raises, to put up their hand, to interrupt somebody else, to disagree with somebody else. These are huge things in tech. These differences, I think, are interesting and such a good demonstrator of why we are fundamentally different as boys and girls, because they are not just different between the genders, but there are differences within the genders. So you will have men with lower levels of testosterone and women with higher levels of testosterone, and that's how you get some of this overlapping, where not all men ride motorbikes and engage in extreme sports, and there are actually a chunk of women who do that. Quite often those differences, not always, it's not that deterministic, quite often those differences are rooted in prenatal testosterone, and they drive certain behaviours. So when it comes to agreeableness, obviously that's a less risky thing to do, to agree with somebody. So I can see how these links would be there. But I get that it's awkward, because it's now starting to sound like I'm saying, well, why do you have women in there? And I think this exposes the moral bias of the left here, that they are engaging in consequentialism. And that is saying, I do not like the consequence of this idea. I'm denying the consequence of this idea, so I'm going to deny the facts that led us there. And I can kind of understand that, because arguments for biological differences between men and women, between different races, have often been used to oppress minorities, to stop black people or women from voting, even involved the forced sterilization of some black people in programs called eugenics. It can lead to some really unpleasant places, but I think it can also lead us to a greater understanding of the world that we're in, and to capitalize on those differences between us. Also, the nature versus nurture argument, if I can just put this little point in there, is kind of stupid, because it's a false dichotomy. It's not nature or nurture. We don't come out of the womb with a pre-written neurology. In fact, we're hugely plastic up in our heads. One of the greatest examples of the plasticity of the mind was a study that was done autopsying London cab drivers. Now, London cab drivers are forced to sit a test called the Knowledge, which is hugely exhaustive and requires them to study for 2 years sometimes, riding a scooter around London with a clipboard, learning every last one-way street and all of the little systems and night spots and quickest ways to get from A to B. What's been found is that as a result of doing that study, the London cabbies' hippocampuses get physically larger, and the hippocampus is the brain region that is associated with developing a 3D map of the world. What this suggests is it's not nature or nurture, it's a bit of both. Why I think the interest thing is important is because I think there are a few key demonstrators of why it is a difference in interest rather than aptitude. Because we used to say that women weren't smart enough to study medicine or law, and we had barriers in place to stop women studying those things. Somebody in my family told me a story of going to study medicine at Sydney University, only to find out that because she was a woman, her required marks was 5 percentage points higher, because the women, they just come here to meet husbands and they quit halfway through the course when they get pregnant. Horrible stuff, right? She went on to study law and described the interview process at a barrister's chambers being the men were led into one room for snifters and brandy and discussions of which college you went to, while the women were directed into another room, instructed to put their arms behind their head and walk towards the wall, and if their tits touched the wall before their elbows, they were hired. Awful stuff, right? Really terrible stuff. But once those original barriers were lifted, we saw women flood into medicine and flood into law. In fact, in many universities, the number of graduates in both medicine and law, women outnumber men. There was no such barrier to entering programming as a woman. In fact, many of the first programmers were women, and it's a skill that you can learn in the privacy of your own home. I know this. I've written bits of code for the Financial Conduct Authority. Obviously, nothing very extreme or complex, but it is a skill you can sit and learn at home. It's incredibly democratic. So to suggest that it's universities and cultures that are keeping people out is slightly ignoring the fact that we had some worse cultures in some older professions, and they seem to be somewhat ineffective at keeping the women out. The interesting thing is that James Damore is saying, on the other side, of course there are differences between us. That's why we don't want women in tech. That's why we don't want women in leadership. Because why? Because women are more agreeable, because they empathize more, because they're less status driven. That's exactly the bloody leaders you want. One of the biggest problems in tech and most of the hard sciences and STEM fields, because I've got a lot of clients who work in those fields, men and women alike, is that the men butt heads all the time. One of the other genderized differences between how we speak is that men favor data, women favor consensus. One of the problems with the hard sciences is that men are butting heads over data. They're not nearly agreeable enough. They don't empathize with one another enough. I had one tech client described to me meetings they had where people would shout at one another, get engaged in screaming matches, storm out of the room, brush one another's fingers off keyboards so that they could write code themselves. It sounds like a nightmarish environment, and exactly what it needs is more empathy. Exactly what it needs is this greater level of diversity. In fact, the only reason you want diversity is if we're different. And that's why Forbes released a study that was done in 2015 by McKinsey that suggested that companies with the highest levels of gender diversity actually fared far better in terms of profit, and the advantages for racial diversity were far higher. Conversely, the lower levels of diversity you saw, the lower profits you got. It drives business, and part of that is because the teams are getting on better together, because women are perfect leaders for those situations of all those boffiny men who go, no, but my code is better, to see how they all get along together and to find that consensus between them, but also because you're building products that females are using, that people of other races are using. That's exactly what you want. You want a woman sitting there saying, well, I don't expect to find that button there, so why don't we put it somewhere more intuitive? Because they're empathizing with their audience and they are part of their audience. If there was no difference, there would be no reason for this. So what can you do about this? Well, this isn't about just increasing diversity at your workplace. Absolutely, that's some of it. And I strongly recommend any of you who are in positions of power at tech or hard science companies to start encouraging females in there, because you want more females in the building, because it's better for getting teams working well together. You have more insights, more differences of opinion, and you're more likely to build products and make things that your consumers are going to want. It's not just about the diversity without, though. It's about the diversity within, and that drives exactly the same discussion. Because if you've got somebody sitting in front of you who's a male and somebody sitting in front of you who's a female, and they're both coders, the female is far more interesting here. A male who learns coding, like me, is par for the course. There's nothing that interesting about it. The female who learns coding, that's actually really interesting. That is somebody who has an internal diversity, and that's what you're looking for in people. Even when you're looking in the dating market, you're looking for those unique pairings, as I've heard them called. There's somebody who's really loud and funny, but can be quiet sometimes. That person who speaks that bizarre language that you would never expect. Somebody who's able to suddenly play a guitar and you wouldn't have ever expected it from them. It's that internal diversity that makes us most interesting. And in a behavioral marketplace where you're trying to get paid the most for what you're able to do, the more things you're able to do and the more unique and diverse different things you're able to do, the more valuable you are to companies, to people around you, to friends and to partners. Take an audit of who you are and how you behave as a person, and then look at what would be the interesting counterpoints to that. I think the easiest and simplest place to start here is in terms of how we talk to one another. And it's no surprise, because that's basically what I do for a living, and that's work with people on how they talk to one another. What you'll notice if you listen to James Damore speak is that he has a perpetual habit of upward inflecting at the end of sentences. Now, I often talk about the downfalls of this, or the problems with upward inflecting, and there are some, in that you sometimes won't be taken very seriously and it won't really sound like you know what you're thinking. There is also an advantage to it, and since we're on this discussion of women in tech, it's probably the best time to talk about it. And that is, if you speak with those upward inflections, and you've got a softer voice, and a more gentle cadence, you'll feel that other people want to lean into that space. They do want to share their opinions, and that's exactly what we need more of in tech. That's why we need more women in tech, but that's why we also need the men in tech to stretch out, lean into that internal diversity, and sometimes be more willing to listen and sound like you're more willing to listen. It even comes down to what language you can speak and how many words you can speak. If you've got a beautiful vocabulary, then that's fantastic. That already is quite diverse. Do you also have the diversity of ability to clip that back so that you can speak to people with less broad vocabularies and not feel like you're bamboozling them or talking down to them and making them feel like idiots? It's about finding these interesting counterpoints within our own behavior that can make us most valuable on a behavioral marketplace, if you will, where people are looking to hire those most diverse people, those most interesting people, because they will fit niches that we didn't even know we had. So it's about internal diversity, it's about external diversity, it's about stretching your range of behavior to be able to do more things, talk to more people, travel to more places, and be more ways. Get out there, get involved, and goodness, the light is changing, and I'm sweating. And it's partly because I'm talking about feminist issues and I'm worried that I'm going to lose my job, and partly because it's getting hot in here. That was awful. Don't do that again, Harry.